Hey everyone, this is Joey Lindstrom. Thank you so much for joining us today for the December 2017 United for Homes webinar. As most of you know, this is a webinar series that we've been doing all year long to talk about various aspects of our campaign to reform the mortgage interest deduction in order to create revenue for affordable housing programs that would be sufficient enough to end the housing shortage in America. And now we find ourselves in the moment where tax reform really is moving. As Sarah Mickelson, our Director of Public Policy, will explain in a moment, there are some changes to the mortgage interest deduction that are likely, but the second aspect of our campaign to recapture all of the revenue for mortgage interest deduction reform seems less likely, to put it very mildly. So our focus remains trying to defeat this current tax reform bill and continue on United for Homes, though there's some skepticism if that's necessarily going to happen. For those of you who are joining for your first United for Homes webinar or who might be new to your organizations, I can just provide the context that our campaign has been going on since the beginning of 2013. And over the last 5 years, we've garnered support from more than 2,350 organizations throughout the nation. And our work has put mortgage interest deduction at a significant place in tax reform conversations where it actually can be reformed, which 5 years ago seemed like an impossible task. We continue to advance our campaign, though the likely outcome of tax reform will require us to adjust how we engage in the future. And that's something we'll be talking about on a future webinar in January or February of next year. But for right now, most of you are here today because you're hearing a lot in the news about what's in the tax reform bill that's passed through the House and the Senate and currently being conferenced. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Mickelson from our policy team, who will give you more context about that bill.
Wonderful. So, as Joey mentioned, both House and Senate bill. There are a lot of differences between the two, and they're currently working to try and resolve those differences.
We're pausing just for a moment because I think we might have a technology problem. Okay. All right. We just need Sarah to be a little bit closer to the microphone. Sorry about that pause. Go right ahead.
So, as I was saying, the House and Senate have passed their versions of the bill, and they're working to conference to get to a final resolved bill that they could bring to the floor next week. There are a lot of differences between the bills, but a lot of overarching shared qualities between the two. So I wanted to go through a couple of those elements, both in regards to what it means for the United for Homes campaign, but also what it means for affordable housing in general. So we'll start with the mortgage interest deduction. We're really pleased to see that the House bill included some direct changes to the mortgage interest deduction. It lowered the cap, or lowered the size of a mortgage that is eligible for the mortgage interest deduction, from $1 million to the first $500,000 on new home purchases. And while that was a historic first step, we're really disappointed to see that none of the savings from that change was reinvested back into affordable rental housing, as it really should be, and as the United for Homes campaign advocated for. Despite that change, both the House and Senate included indirect changes to the mortgage interest deduction. Both of those bills double the standard tax deduction. As a result of that, that means fewer people would be itemizing to take the mortgage interest deduction, which would result in a change from about 30% of the population taking MID to only 5 or 6%. And we have long advocated for the additional reforms to make it less regressive, as that change would have made it. We are hearing that the final version of the tax bill has been negotiated. Copies of it are being leaked right now to advocates, so we're getting really fresh information about what's going to be in the final bill. We have heard that our expectations about the mortgage interest deduction are in the final bill. We had heard that it would include doubling the standard deduction, and it would lower the cap from $1 million to the first $750,000 on a mortgage, representing a compromise between the House and Senate version. Unfortunately, none of the savings were reinvested into affordable rental housing. All of the savings were going to provide tax breaks for wealthy individuals and for corporations. There are other aspects of the tax bill, though, that we have not heard the details on at this moment, but which remain a really pressing issue for advocates for affordable housing. Both the House and Senate bills preserve the 9% low-income housing tax credit, but the House would eliminate private activity bonds, which essentially means that the 4% low-income housing tax credit would not be triggered. That takes a significant tool off of outside of communities, so they can no longer use it to build affordable rental housing. We have estimated that that change alone would result in about 80,000 fewer affordable apartments that are built or preserved each year, or 800,000 over 10 years. The House also included, or rather, I'll say both bills also included other indirect and direct changes to the mortgage interest deduction by decreasing the corporate tax rate. Many of us are concerned about what that would do to the amount of equity that the housing credit can generate. We have been advocating for a fix to the low-income housing tax credit that would keep it whole in spite of these changes to the corporate tax rate. It is unclear whether or not that fix will be in a final bill as well, although we should be finding out soon, and we'll let people know. And then finally, the Senate bill included some amendments offered by Senator Roberts from Kansas. This would have helped rural communities put together and compete more for the low-income housing tax credit by treating it as a difficult-to-develop area. The problem is that that slightly increased the cost of the low-income housing tax credit, and in order to pay for that, Senator Roberts proposed reducing the basis boost across the board for all basis boosts from 130% to 125%, and that small amount really could make a difference between whether or not deals are made and whether organizations have to find other sources of financing to make that gap. Other tax credits that have an implication for housing are also in the tax bill. The House eliminates the new markets tax credit, and it eliminates the historic tax credit. We do not have confirmation on whether or not that is in the final bill, but there are rumors that the Senate language has been taken on these issues and that they are preserved. Again, that's not confirmed, but as soon as we find out, we'll let people know. Other things I wanted to talk about are the impact that this tax bill will have on items that are outside of the tax code. And really, these issues stem from the fact that either the House or Senate bill, and likely whatever is included in the final bill, will increase deficit spending tremendously. And that will put enormous pressure on Congress to cut resources that we already have through HUD, through USDA, and others. The first threat comes through a 2010 law known as Pay-As-You-Go. This law was put into place to prevent Congress from doing exactly what it does with this tax bill. So it's designed to prevent runaway deficit spending. As a result, this tax bill may trigger that bill, which calls for automatic, mandatory, across-the-board cuts to mandatory housing programs. So dozens of programs are impacted, but including the National Housing Trust Fund. The only way to overcome these automatic cuts is if Congress is willing to pass an amendment or a change to that 2010 law. And in order to do that, they will need 60 votes in the Senate, including Democratic votes. It's unclear whether or not a fix to these mandatory programs will be pursued in the House as well. There are a number of conservative Republicans who I could see opposing a fix to cuts to mandatory programs. It provides them with enormous leverage to make other cuts to mandatory programs, which is something that they've sought after for many years. The second threat comes from just the mere fact of increasing the debt so significantly and the threats of future cuts to both mandatory programs and housing investments through HUD and USDA. We're already starting to hear Republican leaders talk about the need for welfare reform in 2018. It's unclear exactly what they mean by that, but we've heard that that could include things like adding work requirements, time limits, converting programs into block grants, or just straight cuts, both housing programs as well as other resources that the lowest income people rely on to help meet their basic needs. This is a very significant threat that we see coming starting in January 2018. We are on high alert about this and are starting to put together plans for how we can help combat any efforts to weaken these programs. At this time, though, it's unclear how those changes would be implemented. One option that we've heard is coming already is an executive order from President Trump to his administration to look at ways that they can implement these changes on their own without congressional support. It's unclear what the scope of those changes would be, how deep they could go, or if it would be mostly symbolic. We're still doing research into what is possible under executive orders. The other option is that they could use the very same process that they have used to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act and to pass this tax bill. That's a procedure known as the budget reconciliation, which allows changes to programs that are either in the tax code or mandatory programs, but with only 50 votes in the Senate. Obviously, that's a much easier threshold for them to pass, even though they just lost the seat in Alabama last night to a Democrat. This is something that we hear, especially on the House side, that they're very interested in having this fight. It's unclear right now whether or not the Senate, how far Republican senators will want to go in pursuing this, especially in an election a year. But they might see this as the only opportunity they have to really get this done. If they were to go that route of a budget reconciliation, the only housing program that would be at risk likely would be the National Housing Trust Fund. But as I mentioned before, there are many other mandatory programs that lowest income people rely on that would be under threat. That includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and nutrition programs as well. The third option is for them to pursue regular legislation through regular order. That would require 60 votes in the Senate. That is a much tougher route to take, but it's still not outside of the realms of possibility. There are a number of there are a number of Democrats that are very vulnerable in red states that went heavily towards Trump, who would be targeted, and they would try to peel those votes off from the rest of the Democrats to get a bill through. If welfare reform changes were pursued through regular legislation, it could impact any federal means-tested program. So back to the tax bill and what the timeline is. The conference committee is holding a hearing as we speak to discuss and resolve the differences between the House and Senate bills. They've already reached a deal. We're expecting that we'll see a copy of that bill between now and Friday, and votes are likely to happen next week. We're hearing that the House bill could be voted on between Tuesday and Wednesday, and the Senate bill would follow closely thereafter, Wednesday or Thursday. So that means that we have limited time and a lot of work to do to try to continue to stop this bill from being enacted. In front of you, there is a list of the conference committee Republicans. I did not include Democrats on this list because they frankly don't have much leverage in this discussion right now. If you live in one of these districts or states, this should be a very immediate top priority to weigh in with these offices about specific provisions in the bill that are needed. So they would be a good audience to reach out to in terms of asking for restoring private activity bonds, restoring the basis boost for low-income housing tax credits, and other items. The next list that you have in front of you is the list of our top targets for voting against this bill. And I will say the odds are leaning towards Republicans to be able to get this bill through, but that does not mean that we should stop pushing until the very last moment if there's still a possibility that this bill does not get through. In the Senate, we already have Senator Corker, who has voted against the Senate version earlier. We're working to make sure that he remains a no when the bill comes to the floor next week. But we also have 3 other senators that we're turning to. We only need 2 more Republican senators to vote against this bill to stop it in its tracks. So Susan Collins, you may have seen, is already hedging her bets a little. It sounds like she's distancing herself from some of the provisions that are in the reconciled bill. She is an excellent person for us to continue to engage on this and encourage her to vote no. The other 2 senators that are most gettable, if you will, is Senator Flake and McCain, both of whom will not be serving future terms and have less of a stake in ensuring that this bill gets through. They also are 2 members of Congress who feel very deeply about deficit spending and may be likely to oppose this bill from that perspective. In the House, again, there is still a play here to prevent enough votes from getting through on the House side. The best way to target the House is to look at those blue or purple states that have Republicans in their delegation. These members of Congress are under enormous pressure from their constituents about another provision that we didn't talk about today, but that is state and local tax deduction, which the Senate would have eliminated altogether and that the House would have deeply reduced. Since that has such a direct impact on their constituents, they're feeling very vulnerable about this vote. So if you live in California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, Minnesota, or Wisconsin, and your members of Congress are Republicans, it is extremely important that you engage with them as soon as possible and through next week.
All right, this is Joey, and from a field mobilization standpoint, I don't have a lot to add. A lot of what we're trying to get folks to do right now is similar to what we've been doing throughout the campaign. We need you to make calls, send emails, put out tweets, engage your elected officials in social media. The real difference is now we're trying to stop a bill, right? We're specifically trying to stop tax reform, and our hope is that we can defeat this bill and go back to organizing around the Common Sense Housing Investment Act and other opportunities to enact the policy proposal of the United for Homes campaign. I'll really emphasize a couple of things. Number one is the immediacy of your advocacy. It's extremely urgent to do this today, tomorrow. Get in touch with all of the people on the priority lists that Sarah just shared with you. And the second thing I'd like to emphasize is over the last couple of days, there have been a lot of articles and there's been a lot of discussion about the extraordinary unpopularity of the current tax reform bill. And as a result of this, it seems like there might be Republican defections away from the conference bill. I wouldn't necessarily say that's likely, but it's certainly possible. And I'd like to remind all of you that we certainly thought Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was going to be repealed back in July, and it was sort of a surprise and a miracle that that didn't happen. So we're finding ourselves still remaining optimistic that this very negative and very regressive tax reform bill can still be defeated. You know, there's some optimism that that's there. It's not likely, it's possible. So please please make your calls, send emails, send out some tweets. Feel free to retweet what we're putting it out. And if you are looking for a sample email to send, we have one from a call to action that we sent last week. And we can help you with any emails. We can help you find the staff people to call who handle housing in any of these offices, and we'd be happy to be there for you as you mobilize moving forward. So that's all we have for our presentation today. I would expect we have some questions from the audience. Let's see here. Oh, 1 second, this is hard to read. Is there any sample verbiage for tweets? We've been tweeting about the tax reform bill a bunch over the last several weeks, and you can either find those and retweet them, or what we can do is we can package some of the tweets together and send that out with the recording of this webinar as a follow-up. And I should say our tweets are always at NLIHC or at United for Homes, if you're looking for those. If anybody has any other questions, you can pop them into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll give folks about another minute to do so. Oh, I have one question here that says, if the bill passes, what does that mean for the future of the United for Homes campaign? Which is a really good question. We don't know at this point what that necessarily would mean. If a tax reform bill passes like this, obviously it would be hard to continue work on reforming the mortgage interest deduction. So I think what we're really focused on right now is trying to defeat this bill, and based on what passes, I think we'll take stock of where the campaign stands, and we'll want, at the beginning part of next year, as much feedback from all of you moving forward. Any other questions? I don't see. Oh, here we go. I read that there's a tax cut, but some of the current payroll non-taxables will be taxable. This is something I don't know about. Sarah?
I am not exactly sure what this question's getting at, so I'm not the appropriate person to answer that. I'm sorry.
What we'll do is we'll follow up offline and see if we can get you an answer to that question. If the tax bill passes, the anti-housing impacts of property taxation become more important. Are there any plans to reform state and local property taxes in this regard?
So there's a lot of conversation around this precisely for the reason that I mentioned before, which is that those moderate Republicans from blue states are feeling very uneasy about voting for a tax bill that either eliminates state and local tax deduction or significantly curtails it. We've heard that Republicans are trying to find another solution. It's unclear what that could be. We've heard rumors that it could restore not just state and local property taxes, but a proportion of the state and local income taxes or sales taxes that have been eliminated in both the House and Senate bills. They would bring that back. There's another possibility that they bring it back, but they lower the total amount that you can deduct across all three. At this point, it's just too early for us to know what compromise they reached, and because we have not seen the final bill. I will also say that it's really interesting. We've heard that not all Republican senators and House members have seen the compromise that they struck in this negotiated conference bill. That is pretty risky and surprising that Republican leaders would do that to their own members, but that leaves us with a real good opportunity to continue to engage those moderate Republicans and to encourage them to vote no on this bill, regardless of what the compromise is on the state and local tax deduction.
Okay, any other questions? Let's see here. Oh, I should have mentioned there's a question. Can we have a copy of the slides from today? We did put a PDF of all the slides from all of our webinars on the website, and we post recordings there as well. You can find that at United for Homes. www.ccc.org. We will also send a follow-up email to everybody registered for today's webinar that will include the slides and a recording. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Okay. If the bill passes, how soon would it go into effect?
That's a great question, and that is also a piece of Republicans will have to negotiate and compromise on. There's some question, especially when it comes to the corporate tax rate, about whether or not there would be a lag in time into when that would go into effect, versus another option, whether they could just increase the 20% tax rate that they're hoping to apply to corporations. So that is unclear as well. But the provisions impacting the low-income housing tax credit and the mortgage interest deduction, those I believe would take into effect in the tax year 2018. So you would see it on the tax bill that you pay in April of 2019.
There's a question here about possible talking points for reaching out to members of Congress. We did include several bullet points to emphasize in our call to action that we sent out about the Senate bill, and we can include those in the follow-up email that we're sending for this webinar, and then we'll discuss if we should blast those out to our full list over the next couple of days as the conference committee continues to work. And let's see if there are any other questions.
Somebody asked a question about whether or not there is a new tax deduction or a tax deduction for renters. This is something that the Homes campaign was actively pursuing. We tried to reach out to a number of moderate Republicans to see if this was something that they could add to their list of priorities for this tax bill. Unfortunately, that has not happened. There wasn't enough interest to get them to really be pushing for this. It's definitely something that we will continue to look into. We were able to work with Representative Crowley from New York, and he introduced a renter's tax credit bill called the Rent Relief Act. We're really pleased to see how deep it would serve people who have the very lowest incomes. There's a lot of really great things about that bill that's really a fresh way of thinking about housing needs and how to address them. But it's probably something that won't be possible in this tax bill. We're going to have to pursue that through other means at other times.
Okay, we got some great questions coming in. Right now it looks like that's the last one, unless anybody has further questions. All right, seeing none, that's going to wrap it up for us today. But please feel free to get in touch with Sarah or myself or anyone here at NLIHC as we continue to work on tax reform over the coming days through next week. Thank you all for being here, and as always, please consider being a member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're able to do this work because of the support and strength of our members. Thanks for joining us today, and please have a good holiday season. We'll chat with you again in the new year. Bye.